This is chapter number 5, Pastoralists in the Modern World. So pastoralists, who are they? What happened to them in the modern world? This is the picture showing sheep grazing on the bugyals of eastern Garhwal. Garhwal is a region in Uttarakhand in India. So there are two regions basically in Uttarakhand, Kumaon and Garhwal. So this area of where these sheep can graze, these are vast natural pastures on the high mountains that are known as bugyals, about 12,000 feet. Here in this discussion, we are going to talk about nomadic pastoralists. Those pastoralists who own these animals and they are nomadic. That means they move. They don't live in one place. They move from one region, one area to another for their livelihood. You might have seen various pastoralists having goats, sheep, camel and cattle. So where they are going, from where they are coming, we need to understand this and what were their past. First of all, we always see that when we talk about history, we talk about agriculture, we talk about industry, we talk about emperors, the war, etc. But we don't talk about pastoralists, because these are also, their lives matter to everyone. Right? So that is why we need them in our history to understand what their life were. So we will divide this discussion into two parts. First, we'll talk about the pastoral societies of India and then Africa. So the basic thing is the colonial rule, how they impacted the lives of the nomadics, the pastoralists in India and Africa, and how they coped up with the changing pattern of colonialism. This we are going to learn. So we'll talk about India in the first part, the pastoral nomads and their movements. Before that, let me tell you, to understand more, let me show you a map. If you see, this map shows or sums up the discussion, and that is this one. Okay. So we'll start with the discussion of Gujar Bakarwals. This is the Jammu and Kashmir region of or state of India. Then we'll come to Himachal Pradesh, that is Gaddis. Then we'll go to the Bhotiyas and Gujars of Uttarakhand area. And then these central India, we have Banjaras. Then in the Rajasthan and Gujarat, we have Raikas and this Maldharis. If we go down south, we have Dhangars and Kurmas, Kurbas and Golas. We also have in the northeastern state Monpas. So whenever I talk about or we discuss about these, you must understand and must recall that these are the location which we are talking about. These are the pastoralists in India. So let us start our discussion with the, as I said, with the Gujar Bakarwals. So even today we find these Gujar Bakarwals in you can say vast majority in Jammu and Kashmir. They are basically the herders of goat and sheep. So they migrated according to the summer and winter. And what happens, because they have come from some other place, because this area they have started living. Now when the high mountains are covered with snow, that is Jammu and Kashmir region. One is Jammu region, one is Kashmir region. Kashmir region is quite cold, so the high mountains are covered with snow. So they come down to the Shivalik range. Let us understand they come to the region which is near Jammu region. You can understand like this. And this dry scrub forest, these are very good for the pasture for their herds. And by the end of April, now they march towards the northern part, their summer grazing ground. And in between, several households came together for this journey. that means a kind of small village moves, forming a kafila. Kafila means many people moving together. They cross the Pir Panjal and they enter the valley of Kashmir. And once the onset of summer comes, that is, the snow melts and the mountainsides are lush green, and there are different kind of grasses with rich nutritious forage for their herds. By the end of the September, these bakarwals, they move again. Now they do the downward journey back to their winter base. And let me show you how they actually do. See, if this is the mountain area, they are grazing here, their herds. Now if this is filled with say a lot of snow, they need to come down. So this is how this Kashmir region, they generally go in the summers, but in the winter season they come down to the Shivalik region. So this is how, according to the winter and summer, they move along, or you can say they go back and forth. In the same way, the Gaddis are also the shepherds of Himachal Pradesh. They also do the seasonal movement. By April, they move north and spend this summer in Lahore and Spiti. That is, they too spend their winter in the low hills of Shivalik range as the Bakarwals are doing. And they move north, and sometime in the summer they stay at Lahore and Spiti. Now, when the snow melts and the high passes are clear, they again move on to higher mountains. So this is the one very, you can say, default picture of a Gujar mandap on the high mountains in center Garhwal. Now, one thing need to be mentioned here, that the buffaloes cannot climb this much. So they always have these small ones like the goats and sheep. So we were talking about Gaddis. They go to these mountain meadows, and by September they begin their return movement. While coming back also, and while going up also, they stay at the villages of Lahore and Spiti. Okay, so this is how they move. Again, according to the different summer and winter season, they move back and forth. We have certain new words coming, which is Bhabar and Bugyal. Bhabar is a dry forested area below the foothills of Garhwal and Kumaon. As I said, Garhwal and Kumaon is in Uttarakhand, two regions. Bugyal means vast meadows in the high mountains. If you see this picture, this is about Gaddis. So the Gaddis, they are waiting for shearing to begin, shearing of these fur. Now let us come to the region which is called as Uttarakhand, Garhwal and Kumaon region. Gujar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Babbar in the winter, and they went up to high meadows, that is Bugyals in summer. And they were originally from Jammu, but they came here and now they are settled. So this pattern is, if you see the pattern which is common, is the movement between summer and winter of the Himalayas, including the Bhotiyas, Sherpas and Kinauris also do that. So they adjust themselves, adjust their movement and adjust their herd movement according to the available pastures in different places in different seasons. When one is exhausted, unusable, they move to the other place. So this continuous movement also make the pastures to recover, allow them to recover and prevent their overuse. This is a picture of Gaddis sheep being reared. And these are not the only places where we find this pastoralist. In the Indian region, plateaus and plains and deserts of India, there are various other pastoralists. In the Maharashtra region, the Dhangars are important pastoral communities. So if I can tell you the number, in the early 20th century, their population were 4,67,000. And most of them were shepherds, but some of them also were weavers, blanket weavers, and they have buffaloes also. So they stayed at the central plateau of Maharashtra during the monsoon, and this was a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil, and they get thorny scrub, and nothing but dry crops like the bajra can be sown here. In the monsoon, now this tract become a vast grazing ground for the dhangar flocks. By the October, the dhangars harvest their bajra and they move towards the west, and they reach the Konkan about a month of March, that is moving along. So this is the picture of Raika. We'll talk about them just now. Raika camel grazing on the Thar desert in western Rajasthan. We'll come to this in a short while. But these people, Dhangar, from the plateau of this Maharashtra, now they move towards Konkan. At this place, they find high rainfall and soil rich. So here the shepherds in Karnataka, if you see the monsoon conditions, if you see, we just talked about this. So these movement of these different region, that is not the mountain, here the shepherds, they are actually welcomed because they move to Konkan, and they are actually welcome. Why? Because at this time we have two harvests, Kharif and Rabi. So Kharif is the autumn crop, usually harvested between September and October, and Rabi is the spring crop, usually harvested after March. So when they come here, these herders, the Kharif harvest was cut at this time, the field had to be fertilized, and these fields are to be made ready for the next harvest, that is the Rabi harvest. So Dhangar flocks which are coming manure the field, and they fed the stubble. What is the stubble? The lower end of grain stalks left in the ground after harvesting. And these Konkani peasants, they also give supplies of rice to these people, that is the Dhangars. So this is how the things goes, that is, they move from their place to Konkan and back because of the various seasonal changes. Because the sheep cannot live or tolerate the monsoon conditions, so they have to move back. When we come to another place, that is Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, the dry central plateau was covered with stone and grass, inhabited by cattle, goat and sheep herders. The Golas, one of the community, the pastoral community, herded cattle here. Then the Kurumas and Kurubas, they also reared sheep and goats, and they also sold the woven blankets. So they would live near the woods, cultivated small patch of land, engaged in a variety of petty trades also. So here, if you see, there is a difference. The mountain pastoralists, they move in the rhythm with respect to cold and snow. But this region which we are just talking about, that is the central and the south region, the pastoralists move according to monsoon and dry season, right? And it depends on what herds they have, because if they have buffaloes really like the swampy wet conditions, but the sheep doesn't. If we come to the central region, Banjaras, they're also well-known group of graziers. You can find them in Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. They also move long distance, they sell plough cattle, and they do different type of exchange of grain and fodder, these Banjaras. If you see, this is a camel herder in this settlement. So what happens here in the deserts of Rajasthan, the rainfall in this region is uncertain and very small, less, that is meager. Once the cultivated land is there, means they harvest, it actually fluctuated every year. Over vast stretches, you cannot grow any crop. So the Raikas, they combine cultivation with, that is, they do cultivation also and they do pastoralism also. in the monsoon season, the Raikas of Barmer, Jaisalpur, Jodhpur and Bikaner, they stay at their home, where the pastures are available. But by October, when the season is, or the grazing is dry and exhausted, they now move to that place where they find good pastures and water. And they again come back, return to their own place in the next monsoon. One group of Raika, which is known as Maru, that is desert Raika, they herd camel, and another group reared sheep and goats. So some march with camels, some go with sheep and goat, these Raikas. If you see, you can have a look of them. This is a camel fair at Balotra in western Rajasthan. So here Raikas, they sell these camels, they show different type of activities, right? They show you their expertise in the camels. And here is a camel fair at Pushkar, very famous, internationally acclaimed camel fair. So what we see here is that the movement of pastoral groups or life of pastoral groups depend on various factors. They judge, that is, how long they need to stay at one place, at what condition, in which season, and according to that, with proper judgment and judicious decision, they move from here and there in order to get a proper pasture and the exchange or trade they do. So that is, there are different activities they combine: cultivation, trade and herding, in order to get their livelihood. But now, how this pastoralism in India at that time changed when the colonial people came. In the colonial rule, what happened? So these are certain picture of the Maru, Raika. People are talking about their past. Here we have the Maldhari herders moving in search of various pastures. This is the area of Rann of Kutch. So we talked about how these different pastoralists of different regions, they move according to different seasons, according to different pasture opening, and where they are welcome, where they are not. Now, under the colonial rule, what happened? The things changed. Their grazing ground shrank. Their movements were stopped. Revenue they had to pay was increased. And their agricultural stock declined, and their trade and craft were adversely affected. But how did this happen? First of all, the colonial state, they want to transform all the grazing land into cultivated farms. That is, in order to grow something, because they want sources for revenue. Land revenue was one of the main sources of the colonial rule. So what they can do is they can just expand the cultivation area in order to get more revenue. And they wanted to produce jute, cotton, wheat and other agriculture produce so that they can be exported to England. Right? For them, those areas, those land which are not cultivated, they are actually unproductive because they are not giving them any revenue. They are not getting any agriculture product also from there. So it is wasteland for them. And by wasteland, from the mid-19th century, the wasteland rules were enacted in different parts of the country. And most of the areas were taken over and given to selected individuals. And these individuals were granted proper concessions, and they were given encouragement to settle these lands. Some were made headmen of the villages. In most areas, the land taken over by actual grazing tracts, which were used by whom? By pastoralists. So when the cultivation area increases, there is a decrease of pasture and there is a problem for the pastoralists. The second problem or second thing was, by the mid-19th century, there were various forest acts which were actually imposed or enacted. And because of this, the commercially valuable timber like deodar and sal, these areas were declared reserved. Now the pastoralists cannot enter. These areas are protected. Previously, these areas were very good pasture for these people, that is the pastors. They move unrestricted. But now they can't come here, right? Because the colonial people or colonial official, they understand that the grazing, the herds are actually destroying the saplings, the young shoot of trees that germinated on the forest floor. So they need to stop. They prevented new trees from growing, these herders. So they wanted to stop them. So the Forest Act changed the lives of pastoralists. They were just stopped from entering. Very small areas were provided to them, and that was also properly regulated. They now need the permit to enter. There is a word which came, customary means, right, that people are used by custom and tradition. So that they wanted them to have the permit, that is the pastoralists need to have a permit. There is a proper timing for their entry and departure, and if they exceed that timing, then they will be fined, right? So now the area which they have is small. Everything is on the permit. They have to provide money for number of herds they have. The third thing was the British official, they were very suspicious of the nomadic people. They believed on those people which are staying at one place, but those who are moving here and there, the British people or the colonial people, they don't like them, or you can say they are just considered as criminal. In fact, in 1871, colonial government, they passed the Criminal Tribes Act, and because of them, many communities of craftsmen, traders and pastoralists, they were classified now as a criminal tribe, right? So once this act came into picture of force, these communities that came under these criminal tribes, they were forcefully, whether they are just allowed or not allowed, but they were not allowed to move without a permit. The police is keeping a close watch on the so-called criminal tribes. And there was one more thing. To expand the revenue income, the colonial government looked for every possible source where they can put the tax. So they put the tax on land, canal water, salt, trade salt, even on the animals. Now the pastoralists, they were grazing the pasture, they have to give tax on the number of cattle they have. That is the tax per head. They have to give them. And in the decades between 1850 and 1880, the rights to collect tax were given to contractors. Now the contractors, these contractors, they would just take enough money from these poor pastoralists, right? Each of them was given a pass to enter a grazing tract. The cattle herder had to show the pass, they have to pay the tax, the number of cattle's heads he has to pay according to them. The tax is per cattle. That is, if he has 10 cattle, he has to pay X amount. If he has 100 cattle, he has to pay 10 times the amount. How did these changes actually affected the lives of pastoralists? Now, when the areas are cultivated fields, or most of the areas are now cultivated fields, the pasture land will decline. I'll show you. So this is the area where some pastoralists would come. This is second area, third area. Now, if this land is taken over for cultivation by the authorities, only this small area is available for the pastoralists. So all three will come here, right? Now, because of this, the area of grazing becomes less. And as pasture lands, they disappear, most of them, means the stock or most of the pastoralists will come in the small area. And because once most of the cattle will graze here, this area will decline in a faster pace. So because the area is less, they are not being fed well, the camel or the sheep or the goat, any cattle would die. So because of this also, the cattle were diminished in the numbers, and these pastoralists, they faced a lot of problem. Now, how these pastoralists come up with certain solutions? So let us first see that, and then we'll go to the next part. They reacted. Some reduced the number of cattle because the taxation was on the number of cattle, right? And also the pastures were less now. There were not enough pastures to feed large numbers. Then others, they just tried to find out different areas. After 1947, if you say, this Raikas who were traditionally going to Sindh and graze their camel, they now, because of the partition of India and Pakistan, they could not go there. So they need to find new places. They are now finding they migrated to Haryana. Okay. After the harvest is cut, they move to Haryana, because this is the time these fields needs manure, that animal dung, or you can say the waste, provides. And over the years, some rich pastoralists, they are just buying land, they are settling down, they are just giving up this nomadic life. They just don't want to go here and there. They took some other job. And some pastoralists, they borrow money from moneylenders, and at times they lose their cattle and sheep, and they become laborers. They work in small towns. But pastoralists, still we can find them, so they did survive. They did survive. And when pasture lands in one place was close to them, they changed the direction of their movement. They also reduced the size of the herd. They combined the pastoral activity with various other activity to earn something, for the income. They adapted themselves to the modern world, right? But most of the ecologists, they still believe that the mountains and the pastoralism, they are matched to each other. Pastoralism is still ecologically most viable form of life in these mountains. So this is how the new laws, the settlement patterns, and they force the pastoral communities to change their lives, right? So this is how they actually reacted with the changes that were forced on them. Pastoralists in the modern world. We discuss about the pastoralist condition in India, where they are, what were they doing, and how does the colonial rule affected them. Now we will talk about the colonial rule in Africa and how does these pastoralists of Africa got affected and what were the condition situation. So Africa, why we are talking about, this is having half the world's pastoral population. Even today, 22 million Africans, they do pastoral activity for their livelihood. The communities are, if I can show you the areas, let me take you to the map first. So this is Africa, and these are the various areas of these pastoralists: Berbers, Tuareg, Moors, Wudabe, Faluni, Bedouin, Beja, Kabaish, Danankiel, Somali, Herero, Swana, Zulu, and Nama. Now, we will talk about this particular area, which is a combination, or you can say a part of Kenya and a part of Tanzania, and the Maasais. The Maasais lives here. Actually, this is a combination of two places. What happened on Tanganyika? Britain conquered, which was earlier the place called German East Africa during the First World War. So in 1919, this Tanganyika came under British control. And when it attained independence in 1961, it was united with Zanzibar, this Tanganyika, and now the Tanzania was found. Or Tanzania was formed. So this is the area we will be talking about, the Maasais in particular. So these communities which we just saw, the Bedouins, the Berbers, the Maasai, Somali, Buran and Turkana, most of them now live in these semi-arid grasslands and deserts where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. What they do, they raise cattle, camels, goats, sheep, donkeys, they sell milk, meats, animal skin and wool. Some of them also do trade and transport, and they combine the pastoral activity with agriculture, right? So like pastoralists in India, the lives of African pastoralists, they also changed between the colonial rule and after the colonial rule, that is the post-colonial period. So what are these changes? This is the view of Maasai. You can see the Kilimanjaro in the background. Now the Maasais, traditionally they just don't allow, or they don't believe in tilling the land. This was crime against the nature, that was their belief. But slowly and steadily, you can say gradually, they understood the situation and then they did that. So we will talk about a particular pastoral community. As I said, we'll talk about the Maasai, and the Maasai cattle herders live primarily in East Africa, that is 300,000 in Kenya and another 150,000 in Tanzania. So what were the regulations, what were the restrictions on their movement, and how the drought, the lives affected when the drought was there, and how the social relationship changed between them. So where have the grazing lands gone? What do we mean when we say this? Is that the problems of the Maasais they faced was the continuous loss of their grazing land. Even before the colonial times, Maasai land stretched over, as we saw, to North Kenya and it's the steppes of northern Tanzania. So there are two parts, the two countries being involved. In the late 19th century, when these European imperial powers, they scrambled for territorial possessions in whole Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies, in 1885, this Maasai land, which is this part, was cut into half, and there were two different international boundaries between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. So now the best grazing land was taken over for whom? For the white settlers, and the Maasais were just pushed to a very small area which is in the south of Kenya and Tanzania. If you talk about the numbers, 60% Maasai, the land, the 60% of their pre-colonial lands Maasai lost, and they just were in a very small area where the rainfall was uncertain and the pastures were very poor. The British colonial government from the late 19th century, they encouraged the peasant community for cultivation. They wanted them to expand their cultivation area. But when the cultivation was expanded, the pasture land was changed into cultivated fields. If you go to pre-colonial times, these Maasai pastoralists, they dominated that area economically and politically. But the situation reversed after in between this colonial period. Those areas of grazing now turned into game reserves, like the Masai Mara, Samburu National Park in Kenya, and a very famous Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Those pastoralists, which were natives that belonged to that place, were not allowed to enter these reserves. They can't hunt animals, they can't do anything. And these areas were actually the traditional grounds of the Maasai herding and grazing the cattle. The Serengeti Park, for instance, were created taking 14,760 kilometers of Maasai grazing land. If you see this, this is actually there is no grass, livestock, that is cattle, goat, sheep. These are malnourished. But on the other hand, the national park, the you can say profit increased, because of the land being taken from these poor pastoralists. This is again a picture of this title Masai. From where it came? It came from two words, Ma and Sai, that is my people. So they were traditionally nomadic and they depended on milk and meat. High temperatures were there with very low rainfall. The conditions were very dry, dusty, and extremely hot. And in this time, most of the cattle would die, but still they were surviving. So now the grazing area which belonged to this Maasai community, they lost it, and they were just confined to a very small area. And if a particular area is grazed again and again, that means the quality of pastures will be deteriorated. Fodder is always short, so feeding the cattle is the problem, because it was a persistent problem for these people, Maasai. Now the borders were closed. What does this mean? Borders are closed. See, in 19th century, African pastoralists, they can move on a vast land, but the pastures, when they are exhausted, they have to move to a different area to graze their cattle, because this is their necessity. But by the late 19th century, the colonial government, they started putting restriction on their mobility. For example, the Maasai, like them, other pastoral groups, they're also forced to leave the special reserves, and they were limited. They were not allowed to move out with their stock without the permits they were being given. So this was a kind of trouble and harassment for the people who are natives, and who are found disobeying the law. They were just severely punished. And even the pastoralists, they cannot enter the white areas, mainly the market, and they can't even participate in the trade, because the European or the white settlers, they saw these pastoralists as dangerous and savage, so they don't want any type of contact with them. But it was not always possible, because the white have to have the labor, and that comes from the pastoralists or black people, boring mines, building roads and towns. So labor is always needed. So these restrictions actually change the lives of pastoralists. The pastorals, you can say the pasture and the trading, what they were doing earlier, it was devastated. Okay. So earlier the pastoralists not only looked after the herds, but they also traded certain products. But with these restrictions, they could do none. Now, when the pastures dry, we need to learn about these situation, what they actually experience. So, droughts, particularly this place, because this place lies in that equatorial nearest region, that there will always be a problem of drought. Now, when the rain fails or pastures are dry, cattle will starve unless they are moved to certain more areas where their food is available. So traditionally, these pastoralists, they were nomadic. They would move from one place to another, and that will also survive the bad times, and any crisis, they can always go to other place. But when the colonial rule came, they were just given a fixed area. They were prohibited from moving here and there. So this is how this thing happened, and then the drought came. Now, since they could not shift their cattle, because the drought came, what would happen to the cattle? They will die. They will die. If you talk in numbers, in 1930, the Maasai in Kenya possessed 7 1,20,000, that is 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, 171,000 donkeys. But in just a severe drought in 1933 and 1934, they just lost half of them. They all died. Half of them died. So this is how the restriction were the responsible, or the factor which is responsible for the decline of the animal stock of pastoralists. But not all were equally affected, because there are different, you can say, hierarchy. In pre-colonial times, this Maasai society was divided into two categories: elders and warriors. Elder would meet, they will decide the fate of the community, they discuss about various aspects. The warriors were younger people. Elders were actually elder. The warriors would fight for the protection of tribe, and they would raid the other tribe and try to get the cattle from there. That is, steal the cattle, or forcibly get the cattle. That is why they were warrior. But still, the warrior were under the elders. And in order to administer the affairs of Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures which has very important implication. They actually appointed chief of different subgroup of these Maasai community, Maasai society, who were actually made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. And the British also imposed the restriction, because the main task of these warriors were they were fighting, that is warfare, and they were raiding other tribes to get the cattle from there. So they stopped everything. So now the elders and warriors, they don't have any differentiation now. So the chief they appointed, that is the colonial government appointed, they have regular income. They could buy the animals, goods and land. And others, because they were just poor, and those appointed by colonial government, they can go here and there. They can go to the, say, urban areas. So they were having a very good life. So there was a difference between in their economic positions also. So these incurred or got very much income and accumulated wealth. The others, they became poorer and poorer. And the life history of these poor pastoralists, who depended only on the livestock, were very different. In the time of war and famine, they just lost everything. They just went for work, because they could even do some act out living as charcoal burners. Other would do some odd jobs like road building or construction. So the social change, as we saw, occurred at two levels. First, the traditional difference between the age, that is, we saw the two society parts, that is the elders and warriors, they were just disturbed. It didn't break down, but it was disturbed. And there was a difference between the wealthy and the poor pastoralists, as we saw that some of them being appointed by colonial government, they just become wealthy. Others were poor. So what we saw in the two discussions, the Indian and the African pastoralists, that they were having a wide area to graze cattle and to rear them, but after the restriction there was so much of problem they faced, and the thing actually diminished, and some of them they raised the voice also, but you know what happens. But we need to understand that environmentalists and economists, they say that this nomadism or pastoralism, this is perfectly suitable for certain regions. So we need to understand this, and we need to talk about them in the history, because they are also those people who are important to our society. So this is all about this topic. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.